Good afternoon, good morning. On behalf of Ms. Cristina Duarte, Under Secretary General and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Africa, I'm pleased to welcome you all to this conversation on building effective intellectual property systems to catalyze local innovation in Africa. My name is Kavazeua Katjomuise, Senior Economic Affairs Officer and Team Lead, Policy Analysis and Coordination, OSAA. In line with its strategic framework, OSAA launched the Africa Knowledge Network in June 2021 to help bridge the knowledge gap by leveraging the voices and perspectives of African experts and academics. The consultative platform on IPR falls under Cluster 4 on science, technology, and innovation. Today's conversation with the members of the consultative platform on IP is the first in a series of conversations to be organized by the Office on various IPR issues to raise awareness of the importance of IP in promoting sustainable development. The landscape of STI in African countries presents a huge untapped potential to effectively advance Africa's sustainable development, since IP protection can provide increased incentives for innovation and STI research. Stronger IP protection has been viewed as an important tool for advancing Africa's sustainable development. For example, one of the indicators of innovations, the number of patent registrations filed in a country, with 0.6% of the world's patent applications in 2021, Africa lags considerably behind other developing countries. For example, the comparable ratio for Asia and Latin America were respectively 67.6% and 1.6% respectively. Furthermore, the number of applications from residents constituted only 22%, suggesting that most of the applications were submitted by non-residents. Against this backdrop, today's conversation aims to identify existing challenges to IP systems, particularly the patent systems in Africa, and how to overcome these challenges with a view to create an enabling environment to catalyze local innovation. We're joined by 3 distinguished experts of the OSAA Africa Knowledge Network consultative platform on IPR. They are Dr. Tolulope Anthony Adekola, postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition, Munich, Germany. Dr. Bonginkosi Shozi, postdoctoral research scholar at the Institute for Practical Ethics of the University of California, San Diego, and honorary research fellow, Health Law and Ethics, Research Interest Group of the School of Law at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And last but not the least, Dr. Uchenna Felicia Ugwu, lawyer and academic researcher with the Open African Innovation Research Group of the Faculty of Law of the University of Ottawa, and a consultant for the UN Economic Commission for Africa. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Shozi. We look forward to an exciting conversation. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to the moderator, Dr. Shozi. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to chair this particular discussion between myself and some brilliant scholars around the world. And as has already been alluded to, the focus of our discussion this morning is really going to be about the intersection of intellectual property and innovation within the African context. And within that, I am going to be putting a couple of questions to our two panelists who will each have an opportunity to share what their thoughts are, and we will be engaged in a continual discussion. Hopefully, this might spark some questions within the people who are observing this discussion today, and hopefully this can lead to many more interesting and stimulating discussions on each of these fascinating issues. First and foremost, I don't think that we need to do much to establish that there are a number of challenges to the utilization of intellectual property, including patents within the African context. And I think a good place to start then would be by asking, what are the most relevant and prevalent existing IP challenges in the patent systems in the African context in view of mobilizing and protecting local innovation? Tolu, would you mind giving us your views on this particular question?
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you, Bogi, for the opening remarks. Now, the first point I would like to stress before I touch upon some of the existing challenges in the patent systems in Africa is the fact that Africa actually innovates, Africa creates. This is contrary to what people may think. With the peculiar nature of the challenges that African countries face, people would not have survived but for some ability and capacity to innovate and to adapt and to respond to some of the extreme human challenges that they face. So the problem is not that there is no innovation in Africa, but the challenge is more of the fact that what counts as innovation within the global IP innovation governance structure may not have adequately taken into account the dynamics of innovation in Africa. This central point that I've just made will run through some of the issues I will be discussing in the next few minutes. And the first challenge I would touch upon is the ideological contrast between the Western private rights oriented perspective towards knowledge ownership or intellectual property rights, as it were, and Africa's communal public interest oriented approach. So now, development scholars have argued that the global IP innovation ecosystem, which of course mirrors the Western style, is actually ill-suited for the African context. And to be candid, this ideological and cultural clash reflects in a lot of things. First, in the culture of lack of respect for IPR, and sometimes also government's non-prioritization of IP matters. And it's just a contradiction, it's a paradox. And an example of where this paradox finds expression, for example, it's in African traditional medicines and African healing methods, for instance, because due to its inherent characteristics, African traditional medicines encounter problems when you want to situate it within the globally harmonized patent requirements, particularly fulfilling the requirement of novelty and non-obviousness. African traditional medicines are available to everyone within African community. Nobody holds a monopoly right to this. So the first challenge I've been able to identify is this ideological conflict. And this challenge is going to lead me to the next challenge, which highlights the lack of clarity in the patent laws and policy framework of African states. Now that I've established the ideological conflicts, one would expect that African countries would have a context-specific patent system that reflects how local innovation can be promoted. But this is not what we see on the continent. What we see on the continent is a fragmented IP landscape. So there are several questions yet to be answered as to, okay, what exactly does patent mean for local innovation in African invention? How should African countries map out an Afrocentric patent system? So these questions are yet to be answered on the continent. Now, in addition to the global frameworks and platforms like the WTO, WIPO, the TRIPS agreement, there are several regional and sub-regional frameworks located in either IP regional organizations like HARIPO and OAP, or the regional economic communities like ECOWAS, like East African Community, SADC, and lots more. And this challenge of fragmentation is also further complicated by the fact that one African country can belong to multiple regional economic communities. And these regional economic communities often have divergent views towards IP law. And now, most African countries are also signatories to TRIPS agreement. They are also signatories to several WIPO treaties. They are signatories to several free trade agreements. They are signatories to several investment deals with complicated IP chapters. So we have this lack of direction. There is no ideology that underpins our definition of local innovation vis-a-vis patent law, and how we can situate our local context within the globally harmonized patent system. So a very good example is like HARIPO, for instance, has a flexible patent registration mechanism. You can register through the domestic route, through the patent offices of any of the 17 member states. You can also register through the regional platform. But in OAP operates a unitary registration system. It's unified. So this lack of policy coherence and legal clarity, coupled with multi-layered obligations here and there, impedes all efforts geared towards stimulating local innovation, driving innovation within the African context. Now, another challenge I will touch upon is, given the fact that patents is linked to technology, there are some non-IP or non-legal related challenges revolving around mobilizing and promoting local innovation in Africa. And one is poor and unsteady research and development funding. Most universities are not well funded. And, for local innovation in Africa to count within the global harmonized patent structure, these challenges has to be addressed. Now, for instance, in 2006, member countries of the African Union made a decision that they would commit 1% of their GDP to R&D. But in 2019, I think the research shows that only 0.42% has been committed to these, and this is a sharp contrast to the global average of 1.7%. So local research and development is meant to drive basic research and set pathways for the transfer and dissemination of local innovation. The universities are meant to tap into what is happening within the African community and African context, and then turn it into what can sell within the global space. But we are not saying this, and this is a very fundamental challenge. So the last challenge I would like to touch upon, there are several procedural and substantive challenges also. Expensive patent registration fees in some African countries, bureaucratic patenting procedures in some countries, and most importantly, lack of substantive patent examination. So fundamentally, most African countries, if not all, lack substantive patent examination. Even South Africa, which has the highest number of patent applications, do not carry out substantive examination of patent applications. And I reckon there's this study also, I think in 2018, which shows that even in HARIPO, within the HARIPO framework, there are only 6 examiners, and this is, when you don't have substantive patent examination, it defeats the very essence of patents. It means that the patent offices, at best, will just be dumping grounds where you just dump innovation and you are not really sure whether these inventions, so to speak, actually have any meaningful or would have any meaningful impact on the society as it were. So these are some of the challenges that I have identified, which I believe contributes very significantly to the challenge, or the existing challenges in mobilizing local innovation using patents as an instrument. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was really fascinating. I think you covered a lot of different things. I did observe, though, there seems to be a unifying theme in what you're saying, or at least a theme that has two parts. One of them is this idea, right, that the patent system exists to advance innovation, but the current patent regime was conceptualized within a largely what we might call Eurocentric paradigm that just doesn't work in the African context. And there's all of these points of conflict. And these conflicts are sort of magnified by the fact that African countries have multiple commitments to regional organizations and to global organizations and through other countries, like through free trade agreements and things of that nature. And so there is no unified vision of what an African contextually specific patent system looks like. So I think there begins to be a question of what we can do about that, which I think we can maybe explore in a bit more detail later. I would like you to maybe spend like 30 seconds saying more on one thing that you alluded to, which is that you observed that there tends to not be a respect for intellectual property rights in the African context. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah. What I meant by that, when like I mentioned, the global IP landscape is, let me use the word strange to the African culture and context. So when you now begin to raise awareness in any African country, respect IP, it's strange to them because they do not know what it means for an individual to hold monopoly rights over public good or over whatsoever invention. It's not really, it's a cultural clash kind of. So that was what I meant by respect for the Western styled IP rights. It's actually a challenge, which is rooted in culture.
Yeah, I think that there are multiple examples of this. There's been, for example, multiple discussions about how one might conceptualize piracy within the African context, given that many industries, including the film industry in Nigeria, seems to flout the traditional ideas of copyright because they're so strange and foreign. Thank you so much. And I think now we should give our other panelist, Uche, an opportunity to share her thoughts on this question of what barriers and existing challenges there are for patent systems in the African context that stand in the way of this goal of mobilizing and protecting local innovation. Over to you.
Thank you, Bongi. I think Tolu has mentioned some of the challenges. In addition, I would say one big challenge has been, what do you define as an innovation? Under formal multilateral agreements, such as the WTO TRIPS agreement, it grants protection, patent protection, to inventions that are new, that are non-obvious and industrially applicable. In the case of traditional knowledge or incremental inventions, this leaves out a lot of things because, for example, in a place where people collectively have knowledge about plants, about plant varieties, about the genetic resources, then not in that case, not a single person can say, okay, this might not necessarily be new in the scientific form of new. It develops by incremental knowledge. What your forefathers knew, you pass it on to another group, to another generation, and they keep improving on that. They do improve on that. It might not necessarily be new, it might be incremental knowledge. But in some cases, which has been applied successfully by countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, especially, and even South Africa to an extent, they allow incremental innovation and recognize it as, hey, this is actually a form of creativity, which can be protected. Secondly, there's been another challenge has been the lack of protection of local plant varieties, traditional knowledge, and genetic resources related to this traditional knowledge. So it might surprise people to know that under a patent system, if you buy a seed that has been improved genetically to reproduce more, you can't replant it the next year. It's not actually yours. It belongs to the person, whoever produced the nice, good seed. Many of them put in place an item that once the seed is planted for the first time, it will die off for the second time if you try to replant it. Yet the farmers should be able to have access to their seeds to make their own innovations. Oh, let's combine this with this. How does it come out? Let's produce something better. But they're prevented from doing that because of the lack of protection of local plant varieties and traditional knowledge. This is left out. Also, a third thing is that I'll say a third challenge could be the fact that there's a lot of red tape. Tolu has alluded to that. Before you can register or have your patent recognized. In some countries, like in the EU states, they have the principle of equivalency. If you registered it in Switzerland, they'll recognize it in France. But we have a lot of challenges in that direction. So that makes it more difficult. And I would say one final thing could be the lack of open access. Down on the ground, open access to certain knowledge. Our online capacities are much lower. And there I strongly agree with what Tolu has said, that for the need to develop infrastructure, research capacity within these countries so that you're not just generating knowledge, but different people can access it.
Thank you so much, Uche. I think you've touched on a number of really important issues. I think what's coming up from the barriers that you're mentioning specifically is this idea, right? As you so eloquently put it, what is innovation? Because how we construct that really defines the entirety of how the system functions. And I think what many of your barriers point out so beautifully is this idea that these systems are supposed to exist to advance innovation. But if they are constructed in particular ways, they can actively obstruct innovation. And I think that that's something that we should definitely give more attention to, and we'll potentially get to come to in a minute. I think what I'd like to hear you talk more about specifically is this question of procedural red tape. You alluded to it a bit, but what do you think practically for innovators, especially in the African context, is the primary procedural obstruction to them protecting their creativity and innovation?
I think the challenge that they mostly face is that it takes a long time. The whole process of patenting an item, it takes a long time. Those that I've referred to as well say that it's expensive. It costs a lot, even where you're ready to do it, it costs a lot. And then thirdly, it seems that the implementation of the process is not always carried out in many African countries. So you can have a patent and yet somebody else can pick up your item and still produce a generic form of it and still gain from it. And nothing is going to be done about it. It's not effectively implemented. Where the law is not effective, it will not be respected. And people say, why should I waste my time and money trying to get a patent if there's nothing to gain from it.
Wow, I mean, that's a very brilliant point. So that no one can accuse us of being purely sort of obstructive, I think we've identified a lot of problems. So let's turn our minds towards solutions. Beginning with you, Tolu, what kind of policy options would you recommend that can be implemented or that have been proposed elsewhere that you see as potentially being able to address some of these challenges at a national, regional, and even international level?
Well, thank you, Bogi. I think this is the most interesting part of this conversation, working out solutions and carving out policy options, because I and Uche, we've identified a lot of challenges. And so discussing the policy options, I will start, first at the international level, and then the regional level, and then the national level. Now, in all fairness, I must say that at the international level, Africa has a track record of pushing for an international IP governance that reflects its socio-economic contexts and that of developing countries in general, in all fairness. And this has been happening, at the WIPO platform during the Ugwu negotiations, pre-trips, post-trips, the Doha development agenda. There has always been efforts to push back and to, clamor for an IP system that reflects the realities of African innovation, no doubt. But my recommendation at the international level is one, African countries should do more, and even much more now that we are approaching the fourth industrial revolution. And African countries should continue to use the multilateral platforms, the WTO, the WIPO, like what we are doing here. We should continue to push for better flexibilities and wider policy space that can allow us to accommodate the peculiarities of our innovation dynamics. Now, the COVID-19 TRIPS waiver is just a very good example. Although this is a very controversial topic and the ministerial decision is imperfect for me, but it's still a testimony of how engagements at the global level, thanks to South Africa representing Africa, bringing that to the fore. But it's a testimony of how engagements at the global stage can at least help to expand the policy space, no matter how small. Because IP, it's actually a game of interest, right? The global north, their own interest is to protect IP, like they own most of these technologies and they have business interests. But we also have our own interest also. We want to be seen, we want our local innovation to have a voice at the global stage. So that is my recommendation at the international stage. Then at the regional stage, the good thing coming out of Africa is this African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the IP protocol that is currently being drafted. It presents an opportunity for African countries to craft a new Afrocentric knowledge governance in a unique manner for the continent. And I know that most of us are looking forward to this IP protocol. And we really hope it can answer some of the questions that we are asking. And we have so much hope in the experts putting this together. Some of the papers coming out from several platforms. So I'm looking forward to, at the continental level, we can clarify our fundamental priorities for IP, and we can have a unified ideology that reflects our local context. We need an ideology that will run through the entire innovation ecosystem in Africa. And I believe the AFCFTA IP protocol is going to be a very good platform to harmonize our interests and to pursue it for the development of Africa. And then lastly, at the national level, this is the most important stage. Most African countries are net importers of IP. We import pharmaceuticals, we import technologies. As it were, we are very innovative, but we are not really in the game on the global stage. So I think the best approach is to take advantage of the existing flexibilities within the IP field. Now, several papers have been written on this, but I conducted a study recently and I discovered that most IP patent laws of several African countries are actually outdated. The patent law of my country of birth, Nigeria, is 1970. That predates TRIPS agreement and it has not been amended. So most times we complain about the global IP system, but the question is, as we Africans, what have we done with our laws? How have we couched it to take advantage of at least the policy space we have in terms of determining, okay, what are the criteria for patentability? How do we define an inventive step in the African way? So this is very much needed. South Africa, for instance, champions the cause for the TRIPS waiver. But the irony is that there has been several calls for reforms of the patent law in South Africa spanning decades, and nothing seems to be forthcoming. And the irony is the same South Africa that champions the cause for better flexibility for COVID treatments has also not really, created enough space within its own domestic laws to make TRIPS flexibilities usable. So we really need to be sincere with ourselves and ensure that we have these laws in place. Now, African countries also need strong institutions. And when I say strong institutions, I'm not just talking about patent offices that just registers without examination. No, we need strong institutions that will help entrench this ideology of an Afrocentric patent system that will go into the marketplace, and because innovation in Africa likely happens in the informal sector. So the strong institutions will take advantage of all these little details that the global north cannot and they could not have envisaged because it is not their context, right? So we need strong institutions that really ensure that we have patent laws and policies that reflects the everyday realities of a typical African society. And then two more recommendations. One is, we are in this age of TRIPS plus agreements, flying all around, free trade agreements and investment deals. I think African countries, we need to be very, very conscious, and we should be very careful in, not blindly transplanting some IP maximalist ideologies into our domestic laws through this free trade agreements, because it's going to really affect any progress we make with the African Continental Free Trade IP Protocol. So, and as scholars also, we must stay at alert and keep writing and keep using platforms like this to ensure that we push back at any attempts to distort the dynamics of innovation in Africa. Common examples of TRIPS plus agreements like expansion of patent terms beyond 20 years, evergreening provisions, pharmaceutical test data exclusivity, and lots. Also, we need massive and continuous training of judicial officers and enforcement agents, patent matters. That's very, very important. We also need constant awareness. The informal sector do not need to rely just on English and French. We need to translate some of these IP laws into local languages, and just to make it real, make it more African. That is what is obtainable in China, for instance. They have all the laws, all the regulations mapped out in Chinese language, both the traditional Chinese language and then the simplified Chinese, the Cantonese and the Mandarin. So we should come up with these initiatives also. Then, of course, my recommendation on substantive examination, that is very important. If we do not have enough money to get patent attorneys or engineers and biotech experts to examine applications coming, we can outsource, or we can just have one for the entire continent and pool our resources together. That's what we can achieve collectively, right? So, and then African universities, research institutes needs to be funded, and not just funded to regurgitate researchers coming from Europe or North America, but it's only Africans can solve African problems. it's very hard. I don't think we can have solutions from outside, right? So funding and then ideological underpinning for all the decisions and how the fundings are meant to be spent. So the last point, Uche made reference to open science or open access. It's very much needed. We must continue to push for that. Now, with CRISPR-Cas technology for gene editing, that's for in the agri sector, that can solve the problem of food security. And we need open access to these technologies, like mRNA technology that can help with vaccines for rare diseases. So we need open access to actually build our own technological base and be a better continent for it. So these are some of the solutions that I would like to bring to the fore. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are all, I think, wonderful suggestions. At the core of a lot of what you're saying, I think I observed at least two things. One of them is a lot of the interventions that you're suggesting require a strong political will. And that's something that really has to happen at the ground level within countries to advance things domestically at a regional level and even at the international level. And as you alluded to, so specifically using the South African example, there have been these interesting circumstances where there seems to be political will within very specific and discrete spaces, but you don't see that same energy in other spaces, in terms of like policy movement, in terms of funding, in terms of increasing technical knowledge. And so one begins to question why that kind of discrepancy begins. So that's definitely one piece of it. And then the other one is that it seems like what we need to do in order to realize what you term this Afrocentric vision of the IP system is to take seriously capacity development, specifically in the domains of science, technology, and innovation. One of those, I think, is fairly easy to solve. The other one, I think, is a bit more complicated, specifically the piece on political will. So I'm going to ask you an impossible question. I apologize for this, but what can be done to motivate African decision makers to take these kinds of interventions?
Well, actually, that's a very difficult question to answer because, like I will always say, the easiest thing for African leaders to do is to sign any treaty and then to approve and ratify. But the problem has always been with the implementation. We've had ALPO, for instance, the Pan-African Intellectual Property Organization, and it's failed. We've had the African Model Law for Plant Variety. Maybe UK is going to touch upon that, and it's failed. But I think now with the trend, I think the atmosphere is getting tensed in Africa. The economic challenge, and it's like people are being pushed to the wall, and we really need development now more than ever in healthcare, in food security, the challenge of climate change. So I hope that these challenges will push our political leaders to have no other choice but to implement what is best for the African people and for their development.
We can only hope. Uche.
To respond to that question, one tool that could be effective is the development of public-private partnerships. That happens a lot in developed countries and other developing countries, whereby you don't just wait for the government to do stuff, but where you have a Pan-African Chamber of Commerce or other institutes come together, the business institutes say, these are where our interests lie. And because they have a little bit of money in their pocket, luckily the desire to make money is not limited to certain tribes or countries. The businessman would be ready to put his money where he believes he will get a return on whatever he's investing. So if public-private partnerships were pursued and allowed to actively participate in some of these processes and procedures, and even the implementation of the patent systems, that would definitely make them more effective. And the governments would no longer have because everybody keeps waiting for the government.
I think that's a lovely suggestion. This moving away from the waiting for the government to fix our problems, but rather create spaces where people with their interests, because as Tolu alludes to, this is a game of interests. And so you simply create spaces where people can advance innovation by advancing their own interests. Now, onto your view, Uche, on this question of what kind of policy options can we potentially recommend for the purpose of overcoming the challenges that we have identified at a national, regional, and international level?
Thank you, Bongi. I'll say, first of all, the adoption of the sui generis, or an alternative system of patents, or of defining the frameworks for IP. Most countries don't realize they actually have those flexibilities. They are available, but they don't utilize them. It's available entrenched in Article 27.3b of the TRIPS agreement of the WTO. There are flexibilities under the Convention on Biological Diversity, on the International Treaty on Plants and Genetic Resources for Agriculture. These are available. Another thing countries can do is to allow for farmers' rights. They shouldn't be made subject to the plant breeders' rights, but also recognize that farmers are active participants in the innovative process. We should also allow for protection of traditional knowledge. And by this, it will be important because what is allowed to be protected as a plant variety must be a monoculture. They must be pretty conformatory in a certain way. But a lot of the organic or traditional plants that we have will not fall into those monocultures. If you widen that definition a bit to allow for protection of local plant varieties, then you would definitely have all the local doctors or whatever coming and telling you, hey, this plant can do this, utilize it, and you can get this result. They're sure that will be protected. Prior informed consent and access and benefit sharing provisions would also be very useful, because that would mean that you said earlier what would amount to pirating. It would stop the pirating of genetic resources that are used for innovation. Someone comes and I gave the example of, I believe it's Malaysia, that came and discovered palm oil, took it away. They were the ones to register, and they're now the biggest global exporters of the product. But if you say that, okay, if you come and take a genetic resources, which you only got knowledge about because you interacted with the local people there, then did they actually give you prior informed consent to take away this traditional knowledge or genetic resources? Okay, if you now turn it into an industrial resource, will they be allowed access to share in the benefits that result from that? Because that would help the local innovation to take place down at the end. Finally, there should be exceptions and limitations to patents and other rights. Yes, you need to balance the private right of the entrepreneurs with the public interest in ensuring that sustainable development takes place. And exceptions and limitations for research, for health, and for other purposes are also provided for under Article 30 of the TRIPS agreement. It's to develop, I can't emphasize more the need at the national level to write your own laws. Even though these agreements are there, they're just agreements. Until you enact it into your national law, it has no power, it has no teeth to bite. Even the exceptions and limitations that are currently in place can't do anything. They'll just say you should. It's like telling your child you should do this. Oh, that's all very fine. But it's different from when you say, if you don't do this, then you get into trouble. And I think if we had a one-stop procedure, a single institution, especially under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that could be useful for registering and for the testing and recognition of patents and other products, plant varieties. That could be very useful as well, because that will reduce the red tape that we've alluded to earlier and the costs and uncertainty in the other procedures.
Thank you so much, Uche. I think what you've said has definitely built on what Tolu was beginning to allude to. And it really is about just taking steps, as you've put it, to exploit the existing policy space and to sort of tap into these resources that are already there, but just require a little bit of effort in order to bring them out. And part of that, as you put it, is this idea, right, of like, write your own laws. We know that one of the problems in the African context is this phenomenon where predominantly in this space, technical advice is sought from particular forums that are driven by particular interests that are not necessarily the African interest and the African agenda. And I think that's why it's so important for African countries to really take accountability and say, we're going to write laws and we're going to write them in a way that suit our best interests. So I guess I might ask you, Uche, do you think that African countries are doing enough to help each other in this space?
At the moment, I would say the answer is no. I don't think they're doing enough. Firstly, because they seem to be pretty poor, very focused, as Tolu has alluded to, on national interests alone. Even when the regional agreements in place, for example, we have 8 major regional economic communities in Africa. Yet within those economic communities, someone said to me, hey, we allow for cross-border crossings, we allow for free movement, we allow for non-tax, yet this has not increased our productivity. This has not increased our trade within this regional economic community. And I said to the person, yes, that's actually true, because it's not based on sound economic principles. I would say they're not helping one another enough in that everybody's focused a lot on national interests. Even where the regional agreements exist, I find that a lot of the time they seem to see themselves in conflict with one another. So there does need to be a greater harmonization of interests and value-added production. Don't keep seeing it as a competition, but rather as complementing one another. That's what I think has been the advantage that the EU has had, that has made it more attractive to more people. If people see that this agreement is going to bring about benefits, definitely they would come and join. But I still said, as I said before, don't just keep waiting for the government to do that. Non-state actors could play a very big role in making this happen.
Tolu, do you have any thoughts on this particular question?
Well, I totally align myself with Uche's submissions. But I would just like to say 2 things. One, we have to stop the blame game in Africa. You know, always blaming the global north, the international organizations. This one is responsible for this. I think that should stop. And should see for ourselves what can we do, because there are no friends, there are no, it's what is constant is interest, right? So the second thing after stopping the blame game is to now find an ideology that underpins an Afrocentric innovation ecosystem. That is very, very important. And under that ideology, all the recommendations of private public collaborations, you know, the political will, the IP protocol of the African Free Trade Agreement, all these things can be subsumed under that. And then we can now begin to play the game at the global stage. So I think if we can do these 2 things, and the world will take us serious. It is not the fault of the global north. They don't know what we go through. They don't understand our peculiar challenges. Because when you talk of innovation, innovation is a response to a challenge, right? So when you provide a solution, then it's an invention. An invention is, it comes in response to a problem, right? So I think this is really going to help going forward.
Thank you very much, both of you. We have a little bit of time left. So I guess building on what Tolu was saying, this idea of the Afrocentric ideological patent system, if you might each just say, what is one critical step that you think can be taken immediately towards realizing that within the African context? Uche, you can go first.
Okay, I think one step that could be taken, realizing a general African ideology, would definitely be greater making things known to a larger number of people. IP is seen mostly technically by a lot of people. Even those who are appointed to certain positions see IP as something over their heads. If it could be made known and understandable in a language that is understandable to the man on the street, it's not made to seem to be something afar, I think that would be very useful. And also, there have been the African model law, which Tolu referred to. I think that's a very good example that out of the regional laws that I've seen made so far, that one was, I would say, that had the most Afrocentric view. If these rules could still be looked over and not abandoned, I think they could go a long way in doing that.
Wonderful.
Objective.
Yeah, I love that. It's this idea that a lot of the, I think, obstructions in this space capitalize on the fact that knowledge about intellectual property is really inaccessible, quite ironically. You know, the patent system is premised on this idea that in return to publicizing your innovation, you get this exclusive monopoly. But how accessible is the information that is often associated with these patents? And there's definitely questions there. And so definitely there is a lot of work to be done in this space. And I'd like to think part of what the knowledge network that we're all a part of contributes towards is ameliorating this particular problem of just making knowledge around intellectual property more accessible. Tolu, would you like to share your thoughts?
I think what we should do now is to unite and to continue to have so much faith in our unity. Now, we use the words of Kwame Nkrumah, that popular phrase, Africa unite or perish. The truth of the matter is we have 54 African countries. A country like Togo, for instance, has a population of just 1.2 million people. They do not have the market size to drive IP, because IP is a market mechanism, right? So the best approach is just to ensure that we unite and come together. That's why I am particularly happy and I have so much hope in what is going on with the African Free Trade Agreement and then the upcoming IP protocol. And I know there are some very wonderful experts, Professor Caroline and quite a number of them on that platform trying to push for something that can work for us in the short term and also in the long term. So in the short term, I think what we should do, because the journey towards African development, it's not something that will just come. Even the marriage, of course, being threatened now still, but it's been on for a long time and it keeps getting better and better. But the good thing is we have started the conversation of African unity, and we should continue to ensure that we have conversations that will continue to help that unity and solidify it, because it is a need that we can have this development and have local innovation and have IP, better structure to suit our context and all these good things that we are all hoping that our continent will form.
And on that wonderful note, this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing all of your brilliant knowledge. I continue to be in awe of you both. I think that a lot of people can benefit from the discussion we've had here today, and it's my privilege to have been able to facilitate it. So thank you both, and thank you to our wonderful audience, as well as to OSAA for facilitating this. We are very grateful and we are excited for whatever it is to come from these discussions in these spaces. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
Glad
Bongi.
to contribute. Thank you, Bongi. Thank you, everyone else.